Welcome to the HR Huddle podcast, presented by Sapient Insights Group, the ultimate resource for all things HR. It's time to get in the huddle.
Welcome to Spill the Tea on HR Tech, where we focus on the hottest HR tech news everyone needs to know to be in the know. We break down the news of the week, and we help you make sense of it and what it means for our industry and how it can impact your organization. We're recording today on July 1st. Oh, wow. We're heading into July, my favorite month because it's my birthday month. But July 1st, 2026, I always loved my summer vacations because like July was the real start of it. Like June, you got out of school, but July was the really exciting stuff. And it was obviously when my birthday was, so I left it as a kid. I'm your host, if you don't know that, Stacey Harris, Chief Research Officer and Managing Partner for Sapient Insights Group, a research and advisory firm. And joining me today is my co-host and the conversation, Cliff Stevenson, Director of Research and Principal Analyst for Sapient Insights Group. Cliff, welcome to the show. What varieties of tea do we have to spill today? It's kind of quiet. People are starting to go on vacation. So I think,
Right.
we always think we're not going to do a long show, but I think last time we said it was supposed to be short. It was like an hour and 10 minutes.
Two talkers. I will say that in honor of, you mentioned it, some, hot tea, I think for, our friends in the United States and in Europe, it's especially hot. I'm actually going with the long sleeve, the short sleeve.
Short sleeve,
today.
yeah.
You can see that if you watch us on YouTube, and also say, there's a few different interesting stories. I think we'll go through some news and some acquisitions. A few people news things, and we're going to start talking about some of the implication of some of the stories. I found this to be the last episode as well. It's kind of the reaping of what was sowed a couple of years ago of what is actually happening now. We've kind of gotten out of this phase of, oh, wow, this new AI company, or what's this new thing that AI is doing, and going, okay, people have been using it for a while now. What are some of the repercussions? What are some of the things we're starting to think about? And what else is new that's out there? So pretty excited. We're hoping to keep it cool. We've got a, nice, not too hot. We wish we could do some iced tea. I wouldn't say it's that cool, but we're going to try and cool you down, especially, for anyone that's out there watching out there at the World Cup. It'll still be going on by the time this goes on. And for some of our listeners, your team will still be in. Just statistically, I know that that's true. We'll see about the U.S. who plays tonight.
I know. Yes, we will see. I will have to say it has been great fun watching all of the videos come out of all the different teams in the different states and the different cities. And, I was in Boston not too long ago for a session with UKG and some of their payroll customers, and it was right after the Scottish team kind of took over the city for the weekend, and I think they ran out of beer, is what I heard.
Yes,
I can't imagine that, right? Yeah. So it was so we're definitely seeing, I think, city by city, a takeover of rambunctious, very excited players and fans in all areas, right?
Yeah, exactly. Now you mentioned you had to travel some recently, as you said. Now what were you doing?
The last event, probably. We've got a couple of things in July. Yeah, you were going to be, I think, doing something mid-July, and I got a last minute trip that I just got booked.
Yeah.
With, one of our other organizations. But basically last week, right after I got back from vacation, I came back from vacation for day one, then went to Boston. I had a real great opportunity. UKG had asked me to come up and basically present some data and insights for a small group of their large payroll customers. And particularly, what was great is that they were large organizations, all enterprise size. And we were just kind of brainstorming on what were the things that was going to be the future of payroll, right? Always a good thing to be part of a advisory councils, groups where we're getting to have a chance to talk about these things that are important to everybody. What I really loved was around that table was such a good balance of different roles in the organization. And we had chief financial officers there. We had HRIT and heads of shared services there. We had heads of CHROs there. We had multiple payroll senior leaders. We had total talent rewards leaders. It just goes to show that when it comes to payroll, it is such an important intrinsic thing to organizations, but where it sits isn't always the same thing. And I think it's partly dependent on how the organization views the payroll function, the impact of it. We had some really great conversations about how organizations were consolidating their current systems, thinking about AI, understanding the value proposition of sort of AI in the payroll space and the impact of the data. And this is the one thing that I really enjoyed in this session was I got a chance to really show how important the payroll data is to what we're getting ready to head into. It is the only data set that is current and active and based off of actuals versus predictions, right? And that is the most important thing when we're talking about AI is we want to understand the real behaviors, the real things that came out in our companies. I talked about this a few weeks ago on the time management system. Well, another actual versus predictive data set and how important that is. So yeah, it was fun. I had a really, really good time. Got some great clam chowder
Yeah.
and amazing cannoli at the restaurant we went
Oh,
to.
in the North End for you, or are you
Awesome.
in Lowell? Yeah.
Well, it was the restaurant attached to the hotel, but it was amazing.
Incredible.
The cannoli was great. We took pictures of it. It was that good. So, but we had a
We'll
really good
put that in the
time. Got a
show
chance
notes.
to spend quite a bit of time with the UKG team, and always really got a chance to see our good friend Krista Denon, who was there, and several people who were heads of the payroll group. So, but yeah, and then I know Cliff, you're going to be heading out to Learn event this mid-July to see do some work with Paylocity, right?
Yeah, that's right. The Learn event, in fact, by the time you are listening to this audience on, let's see, July, you'll get this on July uh, 10th or 11th.
Mhm.
You still have time to get out there. The 15th I'll be in Minneapolis, and we're going to be doing a thing, sort of the questions. Well, I don't think it's the exact title, but questions you always wanted to know, but were afraid to ask, sort of thing. I think it's basically what the data tells us that you need to know that you didn't know. I
Yeah.
think it's the actual title. So looking at some of the data, obviously the big reveal of our data is going to be at HR Tech this year. So definitely make sure that by the time you hear this, survey will be closed. Sorry if you missed your chance to take part, but if you did take part, thank you so much. But of course, we'll have some early bird specials for ordering this year's reports. Keep an eye out for that. If you are one of the solution providers, also watch your mailbox. Should be hearing if you're one of the badge award winners, and we'll be going through all of that. Now, this event, I'll be using mostly the data from previous year, but it'll be some of the highlights of here are some of the things that were kind of most surprising. This is really for practitioners going in, right? What are the things that, really stood out in terms of possibly AI use? What stood out in terms of where people were in the use of their systems and in how HR was, the number of integrations that people had. I think that's always surprising. Sometimes it's just nice to know you're not alone in managing these massive systems.
Yeah.
But what I'm going to do, it will be a session where you can come in and just be informed. This won't be just me sitting there and going, look at these slides. Nothing wrong with that, by the way. But you can come in, and if you have a specific question, I'll go up. I'll find it for you on the spot. We'll go through and find those things that you want to know. What are the questions you maybe didn't know to ask? I'll go through those, but then maybe that'll prompt some of your own. So the Learn event, that's LEHRN, and that will be in Minneapolis, technically Bloomington, but if you do a search for that and you're in the area, please stop by.
Yeah. And then that same week, I'll be doing a webinar with Tim Crawford, who's our good friend we've mentioned before, who is a kind of a CIO whisperer, as we call him. He's an industry analyst, but more in the IT technology space, the IT applications area. And I will be doing a session with Cornerstone On Demand. We are Cornerstone, how long are the On Demand? We are we're going to be really talking what I really like is that we're going to be talking not just about sort of how the CIO, the CHRO, the CFO are all working together. It's a topic we've covered a lot in a couple of different webinars. We'll be covering some of that in the conversation. But more importantly, we're going to be talking about how we think about the development and the growth of the culture and the functions inside of our organizations who are building out our AI strategies. How do we ensure that these organizations not only are ready to move, but are maintaining and moving forward with sort of AI innovation in a way that makes sense for us as organizations, but also ensures that the office of the HR, the office of the CIO, and the office of the finance officer are all kind of working together and not working against each other in a lot of ways, because there's so much synergy that needs to be connected and so much data that needs to be sort of thought about holistically. And so we're going to be doing a lot of that. We'll be talking a little bit about some of the workforce intelligence work that Cornerstone just launched, and that will lead into some planning sessions we're going to do at the end of July with them, and then the Cornerstone Chicago event where I'll be keynoting October 6th. And so all that will kind of wrap together this conversation about how we're thinking about preparing our organizations for the not just the use of AI, but the innovation side of our organizations and the development of AI as an ecosystem inside of our organizations. So really exciting conversations. I'm excited again to get to work with Tim as usual. I kind of feel bad, Cliff. You and I haven't done a webinar together in a while, so we're gonna figure
Yeah.
it out, right? I mean,
Well, of course, we'll have our one in late October, going through basically if you missed HR tech, we're going to go through. Plus, we'll go into some more detail. Now, you mentioned being on demand. Those webinars that we mentioned and the events were live, but we do have some webinars on demand. There was one you recently did, Stacey, with Workday on workforce management. You can go to their website and find that.
Yeah.
A couple you did with ADP, a Women at Work one, and HR and IT. Those are separate ones. So both through ADP. Both have, I've seen, had a lot of live listeners and a lot of downloads. So
yeah.
those are
Anytime you get
ones.
2,000 people showing up at a webinar, you know the topic's interesting.
Yeah, I found it fascinating. I went to the Women at Work and I really liked that one.
Yeah, I think they had over. I don't know for sure the numbers this time, but I think they had told me that in the past they've had over 10,000 people attend those sessions. So I think that
Yeah.
is one of the top rated sessions that they have throughout the year. And then
And
you did the Hi Bob event for the Asia Pacific market, and
yeah. And,
yeah,
if you miss that one, and no fault if you're in the, Eastern time zones or in the United States time zones, because we did it for late at night because it
yeah.
needed to be live for Australia and Indonesia. That is also on demand. You can check that out. Although there is a focus on differentiators between the Australian market specifically and kind of what we saw in our larger set. There still has that sort of larger set, our aggregate data. So you can still get a sense of that. Maybe you have some interest too in what's going on with the Australian market. So, I know we've been complaining about the heat here. Of course, it's winter there, but,
Yeah.
we love you all. So I could say we embrace you all, which leads us into our first topic, which is
I was like,
Cyndio.
I'm waiting for this transition clip.
You're like, I hope there's a transition
We
here.
did all of our. Yeah, all right. So
Nope,
you're
that's
gonna
all.
you're
I
gonna
just
make this.
wanted to physically embrace. This is an HR
Yeah.
podcast. So Cyndio has acquired Embrace.ai, Embrace.ai. So this is pretty interesting because we get this agentic AI going into pay equity sort of system. So pretty cool. This is continuing a theme actually from the last episode because the co-founder of Embrace AI is an ex-Workday person, Derek Butts. So pretty interesting. That seems to be kind of how like Google was for tech in the late 90s, early 2000s, or it's like, okay, that's your pedigree. If you come from there, then, that seems to be a good sign. And that seems to be Workday in the modern sense. This one, is pretty interesting because although we've seen a little bit of AI in the compensation space, we haven't really necessarily seen it specifically in this sort of pay equity.
Mm-hmm.
So that's pretty cool, right? Being able to take this and put it into an existing sort of system that you may already have. And it's also great just to see this sort of topic resurfacing.
Yeah, and we see Cyndio in the compensation space, but not as much as I would like. I mean, I think they're definitely growing in the market, and they've been around for a little while, right? They're very global, right? They talk about the fact they've got over 400 global enterprises, right, across 100 countries. So I think they've embraced the idea that compensation is not a conversation that is stuck to a specific region. We do know for the European market, they had some very big looming deadlines for pay equity. So I think this is part of that conversation, bringing that into the market. We know that many countries kick that can down the road a little bit. Our good friend Anita Lenkin has kind of put some highlights on that and very frustratedly said, "Hey, this isn't necessary to kick it down the can," but they are. But I think we will still end up seeing that it is going to drive some real. The hope is, and I think for most large organizations is, why wait until you have to just do this ahead of schedule? Kind of like when a California law comes in place here in the United States or a New York one, like always follow the best practice first, right? And so pay equity is one of those areas where we do know that even in a more conservative market where the employee has a little bit less power, we are seeing here in the United States, even many states have passed sort of pay transparency laws, which leads to a pay equity conversation oftentimes, right? And so, we are, I think, getting an opportunity to really think about where this market is heading and how much can we really embrace the idea. And I think this generation of workers expects to have some pay transparency in almost everything they're doing these days, right?
Yeah, 100%. Another one, I like that you also said they've embraced this idea. I don't know if you meant to do that, but well done.
I did not. But that, yeah, thank you. You're right. Very good.
Another pretty interesting one. So I also want to point out, obviously, it's Embrace.ai. There's, AI in there. But this sort of next acquisition I find pretty interesting because these are not really AI companies. These are kind of existing companies. And this is Corn Ferry.
Yeah.
They've not yet acquired, at least at the time of this recording, they've just gotten into a definitive agreement to acquire AMS. That's the UK-based, I mostly think of them as an RPO. That's the world I came out of. But they do have other services. They do campus recruiting. They have some contingent workforce solutions and do some consulting, right? Some of the services. So pretty interesting because that puts Corn Ferry obviously well into one of the more established brands for the recruiting, or at least the recruiting outsourcing space in the United Kingdom. So pretty interesting. Now, just a little sort of behind the scenes, since we have time for it. Whenever I see a company that has initials, I have to know what they're for, and they will not put it on their website. It stands for Alexander Mann Solutions. Obviously, they've gone way past that. We rarely talk about ADP. What they almost never bring up what that stands for, on and on. But I just was like, I have to know, right?
Yeah.
Because it's too close to so many other company names. I was like, oh man.
This shows my age. I can remember that name as a big name in the sort of executive search area, right? Back when I was in Management Recruiters Internationals, my friends who know me and those who are aware of my history, I used to run the franchise programs and training for Management Recruiters International. That goes way back. One of my first big corporate global jobs, and they were a big name in that market, right? Like that was the brand to sort of connect to. Now, Corn Ferry's done a lot of executive as well, like placement, and so but they're big in RPO now. And that RPO, and I had a really good opportunity when I was at the HR Tech Europe conference to speak to Nikki Hall, who's their CHRO. Not only is she amazing because she thinks about all things I think that are important when you're thinking about an HR function within the organization, but she also understood which was really powerful when I was having conversations, the importance of the relationship with the vendors, the technology vendors who are supporting your HR and talent strategy. So, that's kind of we know a lot of CHROs understand the value of the tech, but I think oftentimes we overlook the importance of that relationship with those vendors. And Nikki was very, very open about her relationship with the vendors who she was working with in that space. I'm excited to see where this takes them and how that's going to impact the organization as a whole, right? I think, we're seeing a little bit of consolidation. We're seeing some upsets in different places in the recruiting and the RPO space. We do know that market is being impacted by the AI conversation. It is one of the number one positions in our research this year was the recruiting and talent acquisition position. If you were an organization sort of under 1,000 employees that would be impacted by AI. Once you got to over 1,000 employees, that we started seeing like shared services and HRIT roles that were going to be impacted mostly by AI. And the impact is always an interesting question because it doesn't always mean that they're going to be replaced. It means that their role is changing, right?
Yes.
And so, I don't, Cliff, you used to be an RPO. I used to do recruiting, right? And I think, the new generation in this space is not only going to have to embrace AI as part of its function, but also understand the ethics, the risks, the impact they're having on their customers as it relates to AI. It's a lot to ask of anyone, right? Whose real role is to just connect with a human being and make sure that they're getting the best job possible for each of them, right?
Yeah, that's exactly it. And what's interesting is I didn't realize that they were one of the leading, AMS being one of the leading campus recruiters. And I've also done that. And that's exactly it, because that is almost always done in person. That's one of the biggest differences. Or if you've never kind of gone through that, there's big campus fairs. Companies will set up specific presences or will work with students directly through sort of job share programs, or they'll set up internships. There's a million ways that they can do it. And none of it really relates to what we call, quote unquote, standard recruiting. It is a very specialized thing that almost always involves personal touch. That's something that stands out a lot to university students. So that is pretty fascinating because it really means you're doubling down on kind of the human side of it, like you just said. Another thing I want to point out, because you mentioned our research, is that Corn Ferry is pretty interesting because I think it was 2 years ago they started showing up as write-ins,
Yes.
and we're going, do you mean the same Corn Ferry?
And
It's
not in
weird.
recruiting, right? Like, I mean,
Yeah,
like, not in the executive search, the recruiting space, right? It was in the
yeah.
skills management space, right? Yeah,
Exactly. And then so much so that we had to add them to the report. And then
yeah,
all of a sudden we're meeting with them at HR Tech and
yeah,
they're going, yeah, we've been trying to do this. Well, we're like, well, we can tell you've been successful because we have this large set of
yeah.
people. We're going, no, that's who I use. I'm like, oh, okay. Skills
Yeah.
management.
You know, it's funny, I always get questions about how do we show up in the report, and I think, maybe just a little PSA for everyone, especially since you've been seeing all these outputs, pushes from everyone in the market. Please take the survey, and I do apologize for all the spam because I do know that it gets to be overwhelming. But it is like anybody can show up in the survey because we get our data from over 100 different distributors. You do not have to distribute to show up in our survey. And a lot of organizations actually don't distribute, right? Many do because they want to reach their entire customer base and they have that option and we give them links and it's easy enough to do. And nobody has to pay us to distribute. That is a really important thing for us, is that everybody has the opportunity to participate in the survey.
In fact, no one may pay us to distribute.
Well,
They're not allowed.
they're not allowed, right? But what is important, I think, is that if you are an organization that has a large employee or a large customer base, usually it has to be at least over about 1,000 customers. It can be a little smaller than that in some of these smaller areas like skills management, but generally we got to see at least 1,000 customers to start to show up organically in a lot of our data sets. But a lot of vendors do. They just show up organically because they come through other organizations like associations, media outlets, through other vendors who you're part of their tech stack, through partners. We had that conversation yesterday. I had that with one of the organizations that maybe one of the reasons they weren't showing up as much as they had is their partnership with a certain organization had sort of cooled a little bit. There's a lot of dynamics that play into it. Some of it's just what size companies are more interested in taking the survey, who's looking to buy. We always know we're a little bit of a canary in that front. I know you don't like that saying canary in the coal mine, but it is
We need
true.
a positive one.
Yes, the positive. We can see who's
We're the
most
bellwether.
interested by who has the highest level of survey responses. A few years ago, enterprises were by and far the most interested. I will say this year, we're going to see a lot of SMB, right? Like
Mhm.
they are the ones who are really interested in doing a lot of, I think, replacement, new systems. So you start to see those things. So anyway, sorry, not to get on a
No.
tangent, but I do think, Corn Ferry it's a unique to see that someone shows up directly in our data set. And that's how we find a lot of organizations. Not that
Yes.
all of us knew Corn Ferry. They were very big in leadership and the work that I did when I was younger in learning and in recruiting.
Executive
But
search, yeah.
it is nice to see that organizations, without trying even sometimes show up in our research, right?
Yeah. It's a very, I know that because we don't have that many stories, I think it's all right to go off a bit of a tangent here. It is one of the more interesting things that Stacey and I get to do with these large data sets is actually going to be coming up in a few weeks where we look through all these write-ins and then we have to go, what? Are you sure? But well, almost all the time we're going, okay, we're just going to pick up the phone and go, so seriously, you guys do payroll? I've never heard of you in my life or whatever it may be, right? And then we find out, and then, we're like, okay. And if you have enough, you could even show up on the chart. That's rare, but at least that's where you'll see when Stacey talks about like, here are some that are starting to show up. We have a whole system of like, here's newer ones or ones that maybe didn't get enough response that you should keep an eye on. That's directly because they write in. And so
Yeah.
we get to kind of be that. I'm trying to think of a
Early
positive
indicator, is that a better saying?
early indicator. Yeah, I
Early
was going to go with
indicator.
bellwether. Yeah, we get to be the weather vane or whatever the case
Yeah.
may be. But it is a really cool thing. So, and then it's neat to see this next step. Now that Corn Ferry, I was looking at some of the numbers that they make, looks like approximately 650 million in revenue per year. With this acquisition, in a few years from now, we could see them get over $1 billion. And that's pretty wild to see, like that kind of growth happening. So another company talking about high growth, one that
Oh,
we were just started talking about because they just
yeah.
started existing, and now we're seeing as a kind of a preferred partner is Remote. Now, again, one of these company names that is tough to like Google search. As a researcher, I'm like, can you come up with something else? So Remote, as in the HR company,
The payroll
is now
company.
partnering with iSolved. So that will give iSolved global hiring, through their partnership with Remote. iSolved is another one when we talk about, well, both of those companies, right?
Yeah.
When we've seen some just exponential growth in the true sense of the word, they're not just doubling in size, they're like tripling.
Well, when you think about, and 200,000 customers are using, iSolve, there's only a few that kind of fall in that big of a range, right? I know a lot of people, because they oftentimes are underneath other brands or they're part of other embedded environments, right? But that's it's in striking distance to some extent with the ADPs and the paychecks, which are massive amounts, right? You start to see, Gusto's much smaller, right? Organizations, but they got kind of large numbers like that. But that's a very large number for them to have. Adding remote from a global perspective, I think, is going to be very exciting for them. We announced, I think last week we announced last one we announced their new AI investment that they
Mm-hmm.
did, right?
Yep. Last episode.
Remote is one I think we have to shout out a little bit. Watch us this fall. You're going to see their name come up in our data again, and they are not someone who's distributed. A lot of partners, though, a lot of partners, and it is showing up in our data in a lot of different ways from a global perspective. So I do think you're going to see more of them. And I was quite interested to see this for myself, because they've had a couple other partners, I think, in this space, but I think remote is the one that we're seeing in the market that has embraced sort of the newer technology and how to do global integration, right?
Mm-hmm. And it's interesting too, because uh, especially in the last few episodes, but really, let's say this year, if we saw last year, most of the acquisitions were about tech, oh, we
Yeah.
bought this AI company. This year, so much of it has been about global movements, right? We just, in the last episode, we talked about Prism through there. Now, admittedly, that was a while back when they bought Listo, and that allowed them to be globally available and have global payroll in a bunch of different countries. And we've seen this now with a few different acquisitions. We've always sort of seen it, but we're really seeing it more and more. Is that starting to be the new frontier, if you will, is saying what can we do? And by that, I should mention too, when we're saying global, we're referring to, if we're saying domestic, we're saying for the U.S. You can probably tell by our accents. I'm sure you can tell we're United States, but I should point out that that does allow a United States company to go global. If you're already a company in UK, you're going, what the heck are you talking about? How does this
Well,
help?
but I do
Yeah.
think it is interesting now, because we do have a lot of organizations who take our data set who are not head. So the way we look at global in
Mm.
our data, I should say, is that you are a multinational, which means you
Yes.
have employees in more than one location, or you are in a single country, which basically means you have all your employees in one country. So that you're either one of those two
Regardless of what
things.
country that is. It can be
Exactly, regardless
offshore.
what country that is. And we generally have more than probably a third, maybe almost not quite a half usually, but at least a third of our data set that comes from what we would consider multinational organizations. And that's really big when you think about how big our data set is, right?
Yeah.
What's interesting is that, to your point, right, that I might be very comfortable with the payroll and the group I have in the European market, right, or the EMEA market in general, right, for who I have as options in payroll. But I really don't have any options in the Asia Pacific market. And so we do see these as a very regional conversations about, we just had a client right now who's going through this exact conversation. Is they picked a good client for doing payroll in the UK. They have someone that they're looking at in the US, but all of a sudden their organization has been asked to spin up an Asia Pacific partner or an Asia Pacific function, and so they needed a payroll in that, and they really were struggling. It's there's not many who can do that, and they know already at this point they now have disparate payrolls, right?
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. And what's we're seeing now too is when we think about iSolve and, mentioning Prism again, is that those are, as you said, organizations that serve smaller organizations.
Yeah.
So it was okay. Yeah. Multinationals make sense for larger organizations, but we're seeing this with small, like under 2,000 person companies.
Yes.
And that's growing more and more. I think this year's data set will be very telling because, as you said, it is a little more reflective of basically the global organizational structure and that most companies are small businesses, right? So if we see these sort of things, that's again the beauty of having these huge data sets. And we see these, we can say with confidence that even smaller businesses are
Yeah.
finding obviously the need to go overseas. But speaking of iSolved, as we have been, Adam Hawes has joined iSolved, and his name, or sorry, his title, I think you pointed out specifically when you said, I love this title. I would love this title too. I'll let you read it out if you'd like.
Yeah, and I don't know Adam Haas directly, but we do know the group that they're creating over there, with Amy Mosier and Pragya, and really thinking about their talent. But Adam's title is Vice President of Communications and Storytelling, which
I
I was
love
like,
that.
oh, that's the, and I know, and I want to, I'm like, well, that's a great sort of,
Yeah.
because there's nothing like a story to have an impact on what you're doing inside your organization and
Oh,
to help you explain
yes.
sort of the power of the organization. And so I just thought that was great. he does have a great long background in working in other sort of
Oh
organizations,
yeah.
that kind of, requirement for HR and HCM. But I think, what I this is both, I think, a commentary on sort of this new role, and wonderful congratulations, Adam. Welcome to the iSolves team. From those of us who are analysts, I'm sure we'll all get a chance to meet you. But also to Amy Mosier, who I think, I just think she thinks differently about her role as HR and how important it is to create an environment where people not only feel sort of supported and safe, but also where they have titles that match where the market is heading and what they're trying to accomplish, not just the work they're doing, right? And I think that's always very uplifting, right?
Yeah, and like we said, his background is pretty interesting, right? Because although he came from Paylocity, I think was his most recent role, he started in some of the big names in just tech. He was at Qualcomm for a few years. He was at Microsoft for over 5 years. So, that's pretty interesting to come from that sort of broad side and then say, okay, my career path is going to be in HR. Once again, shows the sort of velocity that we're seeing in HR tech of like,
Yeah,
this is kind of the spot to be if you really want to be on the cutting edge right now.
yeah. Speaking of, do we? That is just the background I was looking at. I'm like, where did we just had a Paylocity symbol in here, but that was the
Yeah.
background. I'm sorry.
Yeah. Well, we do have another sort of movement here, and that's Josie Sutcliffe joining ChartHop. That's pretty interesting because her background also is pretty fascinating. Because, as mentioned, ChartHop, vice president of marketing, not as cool, but I'm sure Josie could probably ask and get storytelling added onto there. But, there was some stuff in there. The one I think both of us looked at was Oleo. That's, I know, tough spelling, but it's Oleo. But I knew them pretty well, and I think you as well, right? Why don't you go?
Yeah, there was some early on a relationship with Blaine Orler. We had talked to them, but I met Josie in the earliest days back when she was CMO for Vizier as well. So
Oh, yeah.
she kind of left and did around in some non HR, but coming back into this space, I will say, Charthopper is an analytics,
Mhm.
data and analytics solution in the HR space. And I remember talking to Josie early on about the power of data inside organizations. She really understood that value. She really understood the early days of how to grow that conversation with a lot of customers. So I think, this is a really good hire for Charthopper. Love to see Josie come back to the family, I say, is in the HR community. And I think this will be interesting to see sort of Charthopper. I think Hop has I think is trying to figure out sort of
Mm.
its next big stop, but we know that they are oftentimes cited by only a few people in our survey. We never get quite enough to put them on the charts
Mhm.
oftentimes, but they're often cited for sort of ease of use. And they're often cited for sort of their sort of early adopter of certain things within the organization. So it'll be fun to see what Josie does here.
Absolutely. So talking about this sort of big tech platforms, and I can see why some people might be leaving because it seems like more often than not, these are not positive sort of stories that are coming out of this. This one from Meta was about they had basically a system in place. So Meta, I'm sure everyone knows this by now. That's Facebook and all that. I mean, I always think, but then people are like, who? They had a system in place where they were tracking keystrokes and mouse movements. Basically, make sure you're doing what you're supposed to be doing at your computer. Interestingly enough, they also had shown up in the news, not really HR related, but they had shown up because they had told employees that they had to use a certain amount of tokens and found out that, or at least use AI, and then found their token usage was, through the roof, costing them, like however much money, millions. And so they had to shut it down. But this one, they had to halt it because uh, that is another basically venue for hackers and stuff. And there was a data breach that could see everything, including private conversations and keystrokes, including your passwords, right? So,
Well, and that was the thing. I think they said, after they got to, not only they had the hacker, they had digital activity that showed sensitive employee data that was readable by anyone in the company, right? And so this actually highlights a conversation we had when I was at the UKG session, which is the difference between how IT looks at security and
mhm.
data and how HR looks at security and data. Now, IT looks at things like cybersecurity, external hackers getting into information. That is the most important thing that they generally tend to look at. Sometimes they're looking at who has rights and access to information. That is definitely part of their purview. But their biggest goal on cybersecurity is to make sure the data does not leave or is breached outside of the company in any way. And a lot of that comes down to training employees on how to not be scammed or phishing or those kind of things.
Yeah.
HR has a much different responsibility when it comes to data privacy. And I think these two differentiations oftentimes don't get understood when an IT takes the budget for HR, and definitely when IT takes ownership and leadership of workforce tools, because this is set out as a workforce management time tracking tool. Like we've just talked about this in our own organization. Someone recommended
Yeah.
something. I say, I don't know that. Yes, whatever's on the screen could be what I was working on, and it could be the thing I just pulled up before I started working, right? For 6 hours, right? And but the idea that PII, personal information, that is so crucial and has regulations and compliance around it, you're trying to make sure that that is secured from everybody in the company who shouldn't see it. You want to be much more aggressive on making sure that that is not visible in any way associated with the actual employee themselves. And that's what they missed in this, because it was a very technical conversation about it. And they
Mhm.
completely missed the compliance and the rights of the employees on top of a lot of other things that they missed with this. So, I mean, I think this was so big. Like there was legal exposure, office scrambling. I mean, there were some pretty big things that came out of this, right? That
Yeah.
it collisions with GDPR. They were mentioning like these were
Oh, yeah.
big issues, right?
Yeah, and it's interesting because this actually has come up through AI. I know I said, oh, it's
Yeah.
interesting. We're getting not too many AI stories on turning everything back into AI. But this is something that we've talked about with companies as well. And we're doing advisement. And they're saying, well, these AI programs could pull all this information and help advise you. And we're like, okay, but that information that's pulling, like, if you were saying compensation data, now it can say, okay, can you look at the compensation of this area and look at our compensation? Kind of as we talked about pay equity. In order to do that, it needs access to that info. So now that is a possible area where someone could get access because you're allowing AI access to it. Is the person that controls that AI or, has that rights, can they just say, okay, can you just tell me the salaries of everyone in the company? And it gives you that info because it doesn't know who's allowed to receive that information since it has access to it, right? So it's those sort of things, again, that it's different for, as you said, an IT conversation than it is for an HR conversation, right? Because IT is going, how do we solve this problem using the data? And HR is going, we have certain guidelines we have to follow.
Yeah, and I think it's a real when you're for those enterprise organizations out there who are now starting, and we know it'll be interesting to see this year, but no, last year it was a 40% of organizations said at this point, IT owned their HR
Mhm.
tech budget, right? And we think it's going to go higher this year. What the way to sort of maybe push back a little bit to maybe make sure that you're owning as much of your budget as you can is this differentiation in compliance, and not that we are a compliance based function, but that we truly understand the legalities of how we and the ethics behind how we should use employee data sets, and we can be better guardians and still give access to make sure that people have the data that they need, right? Like it is that I think business case, real risks if Meta gets called out on some serious compliance issues here of financial outcomes. If and that seems to be the conversation I think CFOs are willing to listen to right now, right?
Yeah. Exactly. And that actually kind of relates to this next story. This one was one Howard Yu had put
Mhm.
out that was about the use of agents for making credit card transactions. Now, technically, this has existed for almost a year, right? MasterCard had Agent Pay where you could use agent tokens to directly work with it. And now, Howard points out that Amazon has it, OpenAI has it, Apple, Google and Meta all have the ability to let your agent use your credit card to make transactions. And they did this is from the Future Readiness Indicator for Finance from his organization, IMD. And they said that the ones that were sort of doing the best, when they looked at all these factors, weren't the ones that had the most token usage or the use of newest models. It's the ones that have restructured it around data and governance first, right? Because there are certain rules in place. One of the things that, is mentioned is that Howard mentioned is who gets disintermediated, right? There's always an intermediary when you're using a credit card transaction. There's somewhere along the line, either it's your bank or someone's checking for like fraud or making sure that things match up, that there's basically a handshake going on, as they call it, of saying, yep, that's right. But when things are happening at that speed, there's people getting cut out of that loop. That's that
Yeah.
data governance area. So pretty interesting that, it wasn't necessarily those that were like spending the most that were looking to be positioned like they're going to continue using this. It was those that put those guardrails in place.
Yeah, and I think this is going to play into conversations about the pricing
Mm.
for AI, right? Too, because if these agents are actually taking actions like this, right? One, what are you liable for, which you just talked about, and the compliance of that, and what can you do? But then there's also the, are you getting charged for buying? Are you getting charged? Right, like there it is. There's a different component conversation to my employee is buying something, or I am making a net transaction to buy something. But now there's sort of a cost for the transaction and a cost for the agent making the transaction. Like there's this pricing conversation we're hearing over and over again is really becoming. This is connected to that, right? HR team
100%.
ones are really trying to figure out this usage based versus outcome based. Is the outcome that I bought it? Is the outcome that I bought the right thing? Is the outcome that it got approved and I didn't have to do anything, so I didn't have to touch it? Does that make it a better outcome? And we don't know the answer on all this, but these techs are going to play into all that, right?
Hmm. Uh, so yeah, and then there was a pretty interesting one, and that you had sent in. I guess this one it's going to be a tough one to segue into, but this was one from Thomas Otter that I
Yeah.
thought he had written, but he was saying that he wished he had written it.
Yes.
This was from Professor Edward Harcourt, and it is the title, and I'm going to do my best here. We get some Latin, but three cheers for Magnifica Humanitas. The uniqueness of the human doesn't need a theological foundation. Basically, this is a sort of, I don't know how to describe this, but it's basically looking at how do we define a human, right? What actually makes us have value, in this sort of space. So it's pretty fascinating. And it's something that's come up quite a bit in conversations of what do we bring to the conversation, right? It isn't just about like how fast we can process or, the sort of refrain in the early years of AI and HR tech, and by that I mean just like a year or
Yeah.
two ago, was by freeing you up from these tasks, you'll have time to do other stuff. But that other stuff was left vague. It was left like, so what is that other stuff? What is it we're going to do? So this also is something now we're hearing is human in the loop, right? But, it still has to do with understanding what is it that we can do that AI could never do. And I don't just mean like the mistakes that AI makes. It's the understanding of group dynamics and the context and knowing your company history and your culture, I think is something you brought up earlier. So, it's a really fascinating discussion that's, we've kind of moved past the point of job replacement. Anything that's kind of would have happened by now has happened. In fact, we're now seeing people hiring back people that they've, cut because they're like, okay, actually, we did need them. But it comes down to, what is the real skills that we have. And it's not trying to find a different way for AI to do it, but to help us really understand, sometimes it's strangely enough, the mistakes that we make that can make us valuable.
Well, and I think because this was a religious figure who was writing on the impact of AI, and religion aside, what they were asking is, what do we value about a human being, right? And they were getting into very deep philosophical conversations about what is a soul, and is it the wisdom or is it the intelligence? I mean, we've had this discussion, right? That AI might be intelligent, but it doesn't have the wisdom to make the judgment, right? And does the judgment come from the soul or from how you learn or from just being a human being? Because, you know, if it's just that it can do the job, well, we have, animals are intelligent too. I mean, octopuses are some of the most intelligent. We
Mhm.
had just listened to, I think on David Green's podcast, he had the octopus organizational theory, something like that. It was a book that he was
Right.
read, right? It was great. But they were talking about, the intelligence of sort of how they made decisions and how they had decentralized, which I kind of love because it fit in with this article that I was listening to, this idea of decentralized brains inside of each of its individual sort of tentacles, right? And that fed up to the bigger conversation, and it had a humor and things like that. And we, I don't think it is intelligence that we are valuing when it comes to AI on some level. I think, and this is where this was going, which is a little bit scary and sort of gets back to the, do we just like AI because it tells us what we want to hear? What we love tend to be about AI is it does what we want it to do. right? Like there is that thing that it is not just intelligent and can kind of figure things out, but that it can figure things out and do what we want it to do, right? Because if it could figure things out and did what it wanted to do, that would be a different conversation, right? You couldn't control it. And so it's the controlling factor that makes it valuable. And when you can't control it, then what happens, right? So it was a very deep conversation. And I thought, Thomas, I think highlighted it. It was good to see it. I had seen a couple other articles like this that were probably too deep and way too philosophical to sort of bring into a LinkedIn environment. But it similarly we've seen sort of I think part of this was based off sort of some of the commentary from the Pope around his view on AI, right? And if you followed Catholic religion at all, we have politicians who have a view on AI, and I don't know they have any better sense than a religious figure would on what AI is and can do and what it should do inside of your own personal life and your own personal market. It brought up for me that I spent, and I'm going to write a little bit about this, I think, tonight and post it. But I spent this last couple of weeks after when I on vacation with four generations of my family traveling to the Blue Ridge Mountains, right? And the value of what we went through was the experience, the offline things, the things looking out over the vistas, the funny jokes, the mistakes we made and tripping
Mhm.
over rocks and stones and going the wrong way on the road and having to loop back around and making fun of my poor son who was doing all of the driving and him those were the things that we'll probably remember about that trip. And four generations, we did talk about AI. We talked about, could AI help my parents who are struggling to figure out how to get all their bills paid and things like that? Because right now, none of the tech is working very effectively together, right? We talked about how AI should be leveraged by my granddaughter who's 6, if it should at all. Should she touch it? Should we keep it nowhere near her? How do we help her understand what the impact of that is in the market? My 2 young sons' biggest concern about AI wasn't really so much about what it would do in the world, but what it had done to the art industry, their
Yes.
music, their stories, the things that they valued most, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and so I think that for me, this story, and I think this is the conversation we have to be having at the HR level about this is what do we value most about the human being, and what is it that we want to be careful that we don't lose in the process of rethinking what AI could be doing for us just because AI will do what we want it to do. Because if it does what we want it to do, it may not be thinking about what it should do, could do, or where the future might be heading, right? It's a very, very sort of deep conversation, right?
Yeah. Really is. And then yeah, that's really interesting. And that would have been a good one to end on. I
Yeah.
that is a really good sort of wrap up. Although I did find this next one we're going to be talking about. This one was from an article on Diginomica from
Hmm.
John Reed titled "Why Context Isn't Enough: AI Agents Need Real-Time Organizational Truth." And I'm just going to read a couple parts verbatim because it's kind of funny how much it sounds like he's been sitting here in the room with us and talking to us. So he said, enterprise AI is a confounding place to be right now. I was quoting directly from John. The
Right.
frontier model economy brings the unwelcome area of tokenomics as diminishing returns of LLM scales loom. Meanwhile, poorly implemented AI first mandates from Meta and so many others threaten a dystopian workplace. So then he skips ahead and he talks about it's refreshing to hear SAP talk about organizational memory
Yeah.
in its keynote in Orlando. So interesting. And then he goes on to say, for organizational memory to be a viable part of the context layer, it must be dynamically updated, right? So this kind of goes in this idea of what we were just talking about is, yeah, you and I have used AI and we
Yeah.
find that the value that we get from is only when we have it remembering what we've already talked to it about, if that makes
Yeah.
sense. This sort of, and you need that for your whole organization, right? You need it to know like every little thing that we brought up. That's where it can be valuable. You can't just every single time having to reteach it. No, we always are data first. We're not going to just throw out an opinion on something we don't know. That sort of thing. Like it needs to be there and have that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
It needs to be, as they say, dynamically updated with the right authoritative data point, right? Not just, as you said, just telling you what a great question that was.
Right. Yeah, nice to know that it's a great question, right? Yeah, but I think you're right in the sense that that organizational context, that organizational memory, it feels like well, eventually it'll get there. We're just not there yet. And do we want it? Because that seems really big. You get into the meta issue, like I'm tracking everything and everyone and everyone. But I think it's more a matter of how we think about, I do think we have to start to really think about, do we want a centralized versus a decentralized AI? And right now with the agents, the concept is very decentralized, right? And a centralized AI is the idea of this, sort of whole company knowledge. But what we're finding is that the whole company knowledge makes you feel like you might get the answer, but it's missing the pieces that are done offline, the stuff that get talked about in the hallways, the things that get chatted about on text. And I don't know if we want that to be inside of these systems in the long run, because that really does impact ethics and personal and how much. Or do we just know that that's not going to be in there? So that's the piece that the humans always have. And I don't know the answer to that, but I think this is the conversation we're having right now, right?
Yeah. And just as a follow-up, to this idea about the ethics around it, because I will say for all of our talk on AI, we rarely touch upon the outstanding factor besides whether it works within an organization. Its environmental impact, disastrous, the fact that everything it's trained on is copyrighted material and stolen completely, regardless of any sort of legal shenanigans. It's just stolen stuff. So Kate Blanchett, the artist, actress, started this rslmedia.org that you can go to, and it gives you the idea to consent or not consent to use any of your works, your stuff that's out there. There was a lawsuit that had been put against Anthropic, the makers of Claude, Stacey, and I don't know if I ever told you, but I was curious because they, as part of the class action, said, put in anything that you've written. We'll see if it's been stolen. So I put in your book. I'm pointing at it.
I did not know that.
On YouTube just to check. I was like, you could have gotten your 25 cents or whatever they were paying out after a class action. They hadn't stolen it, which tells me that that's why you're always getting wrong answers when you ask Claude things, because they haven't gone to the true authority. But this idea being that, this is going to be an ongoing issue, right? The wealth of knowledge it has, and by that I mean LLMs, is from us, from people, from what we've created. It cannot create anything out of whole cloth, right? So any of the art that it's making, whether that be you ask it to write a play or to make a picture or to write a paper, that all stands on the shoulders of others. So this is an early, I would say, I don't know, a bulwark or something to stop this from happening, or at least the first voices we're starting to hear on what would probably be a little bit of a pushback here on how this whole system got to where we are.
Yeah, the AI rights and usage standards conversation, I think, is huge, and it will be probably pushed mostly by, I think, the movie industry and the audio industry. Just like, to be honest, I think we forget, those of us who are a little older, how important the Napster case was to the internet days, right? Like that was the early days of, can I put something out there, and how that impacted artists, right? And there was a lot of fors and against, and I think we came out on a side that we think is okay, but there's still a lot of issues with it. I think we're going to have to go through some of those same gauntlets here, right?
Yeah, just for the younger ones, Napster was in a case. Basically, there was an online file sharing. I'm sure everyone, if you're on the internet, you're well aware you can just go get the files for systems. But it used to be very difficult. You had to go to this website, Napster, and there are a few others later on, where you could find music files rather than having to go buy CDs. The RAII, I think it was, but one of the big groups that represented the publishers put out a big ad that said, you wouldn't steal a car. And that became a big rallying cry because everyone's like, yes, we would if it were free on the internet. And now with AI, everyone would steal a car,
Yeah.
So speaking of great works that should not be stolen, but that we're going to use with permission, this is the Red Thread Research People Analytics Tech Report. It just came out as of the time of recording, just the day before. It's really wonderful. You should go read it. Stacey, one of our good friends, primary author here. A couple of things that stood out from this report that I found interesting that ties into a lot of the research we've been doing, Stacey, is I'm going to read this one, that AI is now standard, quoting from her post, that 89% of vendors have both traditional machine learning and generative AI. So that's pretty interesting. But they also she'd said vendors will strengthen their own data ethics. So 94% have an internal code of conduct while cutting the ethics support they give customers. So something we've seen is that more than half of organizations don't have any sort of ethical guidelines in the use of AI. Now, giving those organizations credit, it's a brand new technology, right? They didn't have probably how data should be stored when computers first became a thing. They're like, I'll just stick it on there. We don't need to worry about someone stealing it. And then we're like, oh, yes, we do. So, yeah, but it'll be interesting to see how that plays out because, as we just talked about in the meta story and a few others, and pretty much this whole episode, there are a lot of ethical guidelines that you need to have in place that go beyond security and privacy.
Yeah, and thinking about it through the lens of HR versus just the lens of IT is absolutely necessary, which is why I think the vendors play a big role here, which just
Mhm.
makes me really sad that they're pulling back. And I agree with Stacey. We've seen this sort of pullback because one, they don't want to be held accountable. Now, I think what we aren't going to talk about today, but we probably will talk about in our next one because we're getting some additional data on it, is the Workday lawsuit with Mobius, who just came out with a another ruling. Again, we're not to the final end of this challenge yet, but a ruling stating that based off of currently how things are being looked at by that case, that these technology vendors are held accountable to the decisions AI is making if the technology vendor programmed that AI, right? And so this becomes the big conversation about ethics, which is who is responsible for action taken by the AI and how is it trained and developed? Does it go all the way back to an Anthropic if you started with their model? Does it go to you because you have the RAG built into it? Does it stop with the person who bought the technology and made the final decision? We won't know, but that is the most recent thing that came down from that lawsuit, which I think fits really well with where this is at and what Stacey's calling out, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I know we said it was going to be a short episode, but here we are at an hour. I know we talked about a few of the events we're going to be at on it, in addition to the Learn event. By the time you hear this, next week for you. In mid-September, the 21st to 24th, I'll be in the Black Desert, Utah for OC Tanner. We mentioned in October, Stacey, you'll be doing a keynote for Cornerstone in Chicago as part of their Connect series. One or both of us will be at Workday Rising right before HR Tech. And then, of course, HR Tech itself. No need to mention, but we'll be there.
We'll both be
Before
there.
we
Wednesday afternoon is our keynote session, so make
Wednesday
sure you.
afternoon. Yeah, I think we're going to be pretty much on stage nearly every day, though.
Yeah, we have the intensives that we're running on Tuesday. I think we have a session and another intensive that we're running on the last day, Thursday. So we will be the entire session. We'll have things that we are running, but the big findings that everybody's looking for. People want to know like when they have to get in and when they have to leave based off of that. So the nice thing is that it's not going to be on the last day, which we oftentimes get a lot of people pushback on that because people want to go out and talk to the vendors based on seeing what they're seeing. So yeah.
And before we do the wrap up, I also want to say that if you're listening or viewing this, could you let us know how it sounds? We have just switched recording platforms. We're now in Riverside, which is pretty much the industry standard. But I was very disappointed to find out that they don't do this facial filter that they do on Zoom. Now, Stacey annoyingly still looks great, but I look like I just finished 12 rounds against Evander Holyfield. I'm just puffy and bruised, and I don't know what's wrong with my face, but it's very disappointing. I need my smoothing. Where's my smoothing? But also, let us know, how does the audio sound? We're, work in progress. It will hopefully allow us to, do more editing and have a higher quality sound and video when it's all said and done. But, it's a new technology to us. As we just mentioned, new tech, we know what that means.
We got to go through our change management process,
That's right.
definitely. And just a reminder that I know the survey is closed and it will be completely closed by the time you get this. So please, as much as we would love to, at that point, the data's got to be solidified so we can get to the point where we're analyzing it for you. But if you are looking for data or insights, please make sure to reach out to us at research@sapientinsights.com. We will be cleaning the data for the next month, and then we will start to share it out in different venues, but the big launch will be at the HR Technology Conference. Also, just gotta get down to my notes now on where we're at in the script, Cliff. But just a reminder too that if you want to hear about all the coming news and all the things and the places that we're going to be at, please be sure to sign up for our newsletter. That is the best way and the easiest way to be connected with us on an ongoing basis. Be sure to listen to our other podcast on our HR Huddle event. We have multiples and we will be starting some new ones coming up. So if you'd like to support and help the podcast, please subscribe and leave a rating and review where you grab the podcast. And to stay up to date with immediate breaking HR tech news and get all the behind the scenes content, you can follow us at Sapiens Insights on LinkedIn and Instagram. There are some things on Instagram. I believe our team is still working on that. Thanks to our production team, including those who continue to help us build this out: Kelly Kuhn, who's working with us on a pretty regular basis now, Summer Milano, Cole Harris, Cliff, for all of your work, and everyone else who is part of our production and getting this out and to you. We really do appreciate it. Thanks to our listeners and our community. We couldn't do this without you. Your feedback is always welcome and we're interested in it. We do hear you on sometimes being shorter. We do try. That's it for the episode of Spilling the Tea on HR Tech. We hope it's been just the brew you needed to start the engines running this week. We hope it cools down wherever you're at with a really refreshing iced tea. We'll be back in 2 weeks with another pot of, yes, it will be boiling hot HR Tech updates and insights. So thanks, everyone.